Good evening, everybody. I'm Chinmay, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you all on behalf of International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology today evening for the launch of India Just Transition Center. Our effort to ensure that it's a beginning of our effort to ensure that India's energy transition is also socially just and equitable. We'll also be releasing our report on the cross-sectoral landscape of just transition in India today. We're very lucky today to be joined by all of you all from across the country and also across the globe, and our eminent guests and panelists and speakers who have agreed to discuss this issue with us, a very, very important issue, and bring in their own set of expertise on the table to chart the roadmap ahead. We are already at 5:34, so I'm not going to waste more time. We are very short on time and we have lots to discuss and also unveil. So I'll just briefly run you through how this evening will pan out, the next 2 hours, and so that you have a sense of how we are planning to go about it. If you're able to see my screen, we have this event will be broadly divided into 2 parts, where the first part will be the inauguration. I'll run it up. The first part will be the inaugural session, where we will unveil IJTC and we will release our report. It will be followed by an inaugural address by our very distinguished guest today, Shri Vinod Kumar Tiwari, who's Additional Secretary, Ministry of Coal, Shri Jayant Sinha, Member of Parliament from Hazaribagh, Shri Jairam Ramesh, also Member of Parliament, and also, we all know, India's previous Union Environment Minister as well, and Power Minister too. After this, we'll be moving on to the second session, which will be broadly discussing what does the landscape for just transition in India look like right now. So we will open it with a presentation on our report on the cross-sectoral landscape of just transition. It will be followed by a panel discussion where our distinguished panelists, expert panelists are joining us to discuss various, the scale and scope of just transition in India and what is the required roadmap ahead. After this, we will open the house for Q&A for all of us to join the discussion and take it ahead from there. So without further delay in this, I would like to invite Chandrabhushan ji, who's President and CEO of iForest, to take us through what India Just Transition Center is and help us understand the idea and vision behind it.
Thank you, Chinmay, and I would like to welcome everyone, welcome our panelists, speakers, and participants. We are really excited today. I think it's a milestone in the journey that we have embarked on at iForest, and we hope that we will be able to contribute to the entire work on just transition through this center. So I have a short presentation, which I'm going to give you a sense about why we decided to set up this center and what this center is going to do. I think it need not be reiterated that the discussion around climate change has become very, very prominent over the last few years. And this discussion is not anymore about that, we need to do this or that how we will do this. The discussion right now is about how do we reach net zero emission. The discussion is in the next few decades, how do we make sure that we decarbonize the global economy? And it's, easier said than done. If you look at over the last few years, starting actually with IPCC 1.5C report and ending with the recent report of IEA, we have a fairly good idea about how this net zero trajectory looks like. I'm just going to put some of the points that has come out from the IEA report, but I want to emphasize that this is one of the scenarios. There could be multiple scenarios, and scenarios will vary from country to country. But globally, we are now going to electrify things. We have been burning things for 10,000 years, and from the burning society, we are now moving to an electron society. Now, net zero will mean that this electron society will become a reality. And electricity as final energy could be as high as 50%, could be even higher. And this electricity will have to come from fossil fuel, free sources. And which means that we will have to phase out thermal power plants, whether it is gas, coal, or oil. In fact, IEA's projection is that unabated coal without carbon capture and storage, and they have a scenario for how much carbon capture and storage can happen, will have to go down by 90%, oil by 75%. We can continue using gas for a longer duration. But the interesting point is that most of the technology required to do decarbonization over the next 10 years, these things are, decarbonization is not going to happen tomorrow. We have time. We have 3 decades to decarbonize the world. But in this path, the technologies that are required till 2030 is already available. And the remaining technologies will come over the next 2 to 3 decades, which will allow us to decarbonize difficult sectors like industry and heavy transport sector. But it is also important to understand that countries will not start at the same place, neither they are going to finish at the same time. And therefore, this decarbonization trajectory will be different for different countries. Now, we are in the middle of this transition already. In the last 1 week, if you read the newspaper in this country, there is an announcement of 75,000 crore investment by Reliance in renewable energy, storage, and batteries over the next 3 years. Today morning, Bhilwara Group has announced that it's going to set up 1 gigawatt lithium-ion factory in Pune. Now, this transition is happening not only because there is climate change. This transition is happening because people are making money. Technology is available. Now, one way to do it is to leave it to the market to make the transition. But in this scenario, there will be losers. And we need to ensure that we do not have, there will always be losers, but we need to minimize the number. We need to make sure that this transition is socially responsible and environmentally responsible as well. And that is why this entire debate on just transition is taking place now. I also want to point out this entire debate on just transition actually has started happening from 2016 onwards and culminated in Katowice in Poland, and where the Silesian Declaration of Just Transition was signed. And the entire debate on just transition has been influenced by Global North experience. Now, what has been this experience? This experience has been to move from coal to gas and then to renewable. So coal is being phased out over the last few decades in Europe, for example, largely because coal industry is becoming unprofitable. So unprofitability has been a major factor for phasing down of coal industry. Now they want to get rid of oil and gas also because of climate concerns. The transition period for the West has been very large. Just for example, Ruhr in Germany took 50 years to close all its mines. In fact, the last mine in Ruhr was closed only, I think, last year. Coal mine was closed only in last year, in 2020. But now several countries have announced coal phase out. There are global initiatives like Powering Past Coal Alliance. European Commission's initiative, Coal Region in Transition, is taking shape. So there is a lot of momentum on coal phase out in Europe, and now also with Biden administration in the US. But this entire debate is about providing alternatives to formal coal worker and to provide alternative to the formal coal economy. And there is substantial amount of resources being put. For example, Germany has earmarked about $45 billion to close 150 million tons per annum lignite mines and phase out about 42 gigawatt of coal and lignite-based power plants. So the entire debate on just transition in global north is about formal worker and formal economy. In our case, the realities are very different. And we did this study in last year in Ramgarh, Jayant Sinhaji's constituency, and we did household surveys to understand coal dependence. The first thing we found that the dependence is quite large. 1/4 of households have some source of income from coal. Most are informal worker. Formal job is only about 7%. This dependence is low income dependence. Most households make only about 10,000 rupees a month. It is also a spatially concentrated dependence. Within a radius of 25 kilometers, we found most of the people who make income out of coal live within a radius of 25 kilometers. then there is large perceived and indirect dependence. People believe that they cannot live without coal. So while 1/4 makes some money, 3/4 told us that they will suffer if the coal mines go, which means they understand the indirect linkage between coal and their livelihood indirectly. And then there is constructed dependence. When we started reviewing sector after sector, we found that the overwhelming presence of coal and coal-based industries have stymied the development of other sectors. Now, this is the reality that we need to understand when we are talking about just transition in India. The second reality is the profitability of coal mines. So while coal industry in India overall is profitable, and this is the discussion that always happens in Delhi, that coal is profitable overall. But the fact is 70% of CIL coal mines are running into losses, both open cast and underground. It is not a story of only underground mines. In Jharkhand, half of all the operational mines are unprofitable. And they are being closed temporarily or permanently, mostly temporarily, because there is opposition to close these mines from labor union and communities. So over 50% of all the mines are closed temporarily or permanently in Jharkhand. And at the district level, the situation is even very different. So this transition, closing of coal mine is already happening. The problem is this is happening in a very unplanned manner. There is no proper coal mine closure that is taking place, both physical and socioeconomic. And therefore, our imperatives are very different. It's fundamentally different from global north. It is largely about structural changes and socioeconomic transition. It is not only about moving coal worker from coal to some other sector, or moving thermal power worker from thermal power to some other industry, renewable industry, for example. It is about economic diversification in these areas which are highly dependent on coal. It is about investment in social and physical infrastructure, because these areas typically have poor socioeconomic development indicators. It's about how do we repurpose land and physical infrastructure of public sector enterprises. It is about restructuring public sector enterprises, because most of the fossil fuel sector in India is dominated by public sector. And then we will have a shorter time frame. We will have to do it in 3 to 4 decades. We do not have the luxury of time that Germany or other European countries or US had. And then we have finance, governance, and capacity gap that also needs to be very clearly understood. It is in this context that the India Just Transition Center figures out. As I said, we have unique set of challenges of time frame, of scale. The scale of operations and dependence is very large. There is regional and sectoral diversity, an informal economy, the low adaptive capacity of fossil fuel areas, finance and investment requirement, changes in laws and regulations. If we want to repurpose coal mining areas, we will have to change Land Acquisition Act, which Mr. Ramesh authored, and also coal mine closure laws, and then capacity of various actors. And all this will require independent research and advocacy. It will require institutional and programmatic approach, and not just project-based approach. And it will require long-term commitment and engagement. And that's where we have decided to invest long-term commitment and engagement in this field. And therefore, we have decided to set up India Just Transition Center. So our mission is very clear. We want to create an independent platform to enhance knowledge and capacity on just transition in India, as well as look at Global South, because we ourselves have to learn a lot from other countries, other coal and fossil fuel dependent countries of the Global South. We want to support transformative changes for net zero over the next 3 to 4 decades. We want to work towards timely, tangible solution. We understand the problem. Now the time is to provide solutions. We want to strengthen South-South collaboration. And then we want to make just transition narrative more comprehensive from our perspective at the international platform. Right now, the narrative is very much dominated by the Northern experience. We have set ourselves certain objectives, starting from generation of knowledge to mainstreaming idea to build public support, very important. I very strongly believe that this transition in states like Jharkhand and Orissa will not happen because we have renewable energy. It will happen only when we have political and public support. And therefore, building public and political support is going to be very, very important. Engaging with stakeholders, thinking about policy landscape, facilitating planning, and then, as I said, South-South collaboration and international work at international level for both finance and capacity and technology is going to be very important. But most importantly, most of the work will happen in India. While there is a scope to engage internationally, and we should learn and we should take help and support, most of the work will have to happen we will have to do it ourselves. Our intervention areas are 6. As I said, we are investing in research and knowledge building. We are investing in advocacy, communication, capacity building, building alliances. We are going to launch very soon a civil society network on just transition. And then we are setting up a just transition resource hub, which we plan to launch in a couple of months. We have started setting up an institutional structure around this center, and I'm really delighted that all our advisory panel members are here, advisory board members. Anshu is here, Mr. Ramesh is here, Mr. Sinha is here, and then we have Nick Robbins. So we have 4 advisory panel members, all male right now, but we have approached many other colleagues to improve the gender balance of the advisory board over the next couple of months. So this is what India Just Transition Center looks like. Something that we all need to come together and work together to push this agenda. And I'm very happy that we have a very good group of people already who are supporting it, and we look forward to your support and help. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bhushan. Now we will move on to unveil the India Just Transition Center, and for that, and our report as well. So for that, I will ask all our inaugural speakers and our advisory board members to also put up the copy of the IJTC brochure on screen, and then Mr. Bhushan will take us to the website as well.
Yes. This is Jairam has just launched the report.
The brochure.
Okay. Okay. Mr. Sinha is in Hazaribagh. Otherwise, he had the copy of the brochure as well. But I'll take you through the web page that we have developed quickly. So let me just share the screen for the web page. So this is India Just Transition Center web page. As I said, we are going to soon launch the website as well for India Just Transition Center. We have done a very interesting video with all our advisory panel members and team members. And I'll encourage all of you to watch this video. It's about 4 minutes video on what we think we should be doing at India Just Transition Center. We have the team, the advisory board, and the resources that we have collected over the last few months, and the resource hub that we are in the process of developing will have far more information and materials than what we have at this web page. So we have launched the India Just Transition Center. Chinmay, the book now.
Yes. So I request all of you all to put up the book to the screen. This is a report where we try to understand the scale, the scope, and of just transition. It's the first, the starting point of what would be, what we hope would be a bigger body of work, engaging everybody, multiple stakeholders, and a lot of research on the ground as well as at the state and national level. Okay. Now, this is a moment where we would like to, we will have our inaugural speakers speaking on the occasion. And I request Shri Vinod Kumar Tiwari ji, who's the Additional Secretary, Ministry of Coal, to please say a few words on the occasion. And Mr. Tiwari, can you?
Good evening, sir. Glad to see you.
Good evening.
Let me begin formally with a formal salutation. Honorable Sri Jairam Rameshji, Honorable Member Parliament and former Union Minister. Sir, I am basically a forest officer, so I have been meeting you when you are in MOEF. Sri Jayant Sinha, Honorable Member Parliament and former Union Minister. Sri Partho Bhattacharya ji, former colleague from the Ministry of Coal and currently heading Haldia Petrochemical Limited as director. And Sri Chandabhushan ji, CEO iForest, other panelists, members of the advisory group, and also other participants, and the team of entire iForest. Let me congratulate the iForest for launch of the Indian Just Transition Center we just launched, and thank you for making us a part of your story, which in fact is our story. Also, I congratulate them for coming out with a very detailed study report on cross-sectoral landscapes of just transition. It has a lot of data in one place, which normally is scattered and is difficult to find and put them at one place. And thank you for bringing out the report. Launching Just Transition Center is a very timely action to start the thinking and preparation towards the just transition, or JT. I'll refer in my subsequent talk as in short. Real orientation at scales, and that too in democracies like ours, will take a long time, and it will have to negotiate through various processes. Particularly in the federal setup, you will have a lot of political and policy dimensions to it. Just be aware of it. It's not going to be easy. I am not batting for the coal, although I am posted in Ministry of Coal. We recognize that the fossil fuels are finite source, and coal as a dry fuel has a finite life. There is no disputing its emission contribution or either. There may be debate as to when its demand will peak and when we decide to go towards net zero emission and the target date for the same. When the journey to phase out begins and ends, but there is no doubt in our minds about the king coal being replaced by cleaner sources, which may be solar or hydrogen or any other new source. There are other clean technologies also becoming available, and as per one projection we did with Niti Aayog, the coal demand by year 2030 is projected to reach something like 1600 million ton from current consumption level of nearly 1000 metric ton, of which domestic production is about 750 million ton. Beyond this, a lot will depend upon RE, particularly the solar energy, and reducing cost of its establishment, while avoiding global monopolies dictating businesses on technologies and components, wafers, panels, and modules. Also, let us bear in mind that since solar projects are also need land, this too will be a finite source. It's not going to be an infinite source. Will hydrogen be the next source? You don't know. The possibility. When cheaper and more reliable sources become available, coal will automatically get replaced and there will not be any need to push out the fossil fuel. It will get automatically phased out. I am not an expert on just transition. However, after going through the well-documented report of iForest, some thoughts did cross my mind and I am sharing them here. I need to add a caveat also that these are my thoughts and not necessarily the thinking on or policy contemplations of the government. Some issues highlighted in the report do need deeper analysis, and some of the perceptions need putting in context and perspective. India has fourth largest coal resources of the world, with about 100 billion tons of proven reserves, and coal forms currently the backbone of country's energy security and self-reliance. In the absence of similar self-reliant sources, until such resources become abundantly and reliably available in India, we as a country cannot afford to phase out coal as a dry fuel in any short or medium term. The dream of phase out will be some distance in future. This allows us time to plan for the transition. If one door closes, several others will open. We may recall that logging as business reduced drastically in the 70s, but then several other opportunities came our way. Telegrams closed and physical letters stopped moving, but then came the business of online purchases, online transactions, and a lot of courier business has cropped up. And by the way, Department of Post continues in the business. Many textile industries closed down, but their mill provinces offered high-value real estate businesses. So the replacement sources of coal would also require workforce, finance, land, and other resources. Because there is bound to be off-lap, it may induce migration of workforces. Let us not forget that youth of Punjab, despite state experiencing prosperity, never ceased immigration to the west. Making adjustments to the changes and changing scenario is natural to all species, and Homo sapiens are not an exception. However well designed the transition may be, in democracies, political compulsions will continue to influence the course. Governments in democracies loathe imposing new direct taxes, whether direct, indirect, both, so the JT will have to find its own resources. In the study to preparation for JT, age profile of the workforce engaged in coal mining and coal-based industries and their natural attrition also deserves consideration. If majority is going to retire in the normal course of business before the phasing out, the scope of reskilling will be significantly limited. It also calls for a relook at employment as part of the R&R measure against land procurement. Similarly, skilling may be required for those who are being born now in the current year or a few years earlier or maybe a few years later. The skilling agenda needs to be tailored accordingly. It would be fallacious to assume that JT is born in vacuum. Several actions initiated by the government happen to form components of JT now. These appear incoherent in the context of JT because we never felt the need to put them together towards such a unified objective. Now I'll move on to a few thoughts that I would like to share that are happening. There is a focus on skill development and entrepreneurship. Government of India way back in November 2014 recognized the need and set up an independent ministry for the same. Since then, it has been imparting training or orienting skills and reskilling people, particularly youth. Communicating the requirement of JT will help turn the program. District Mineral Fund foundation was initiated 2015. A lot of money is available, and DMF is under the complete control of state governments. Very large amount of contribution is received in many districts. It's applicable to all major minerals. DMF is currently being used for strengthening only the infrastructure. That also occasionally and many times results in deforestation. And guidelines permit also the soft money in terms of skilling, reskilling, livelihood options. Any change in DMF will demand consensus by the majority of the states, as it is not confined to coal-bearing state districts only. If the state wants to use DMF for JT, a consensus needs to be built to seek changes to the guidelines. A similar fund called LADF, let me share that experience. I come from Himachal. For the hydropower projects, for the operation phase, this has been converted into an opportunity to create a stake of communities. 1% of the revenue generated by the hydropower project is shared as personal income of all the stakeholders residing in that area. That goes as a DBT. Ministry also has decided to forego certain coal blocks with low GCV value and having larger or very dense forests, but not carved out for allocation. These are being foregone. Such coal blocks with CIL are also not being projectized and also not being allowed to start extraction. We have started a thing called first mile connectivity to eliminate the road transport from the mine head to the rail loading head, with the idea of reducing the haulage time as also reducing emission, decongest the road, prevent accidents, and in this manner, a lot of road transport will get phased out. So people are getting enough time to readjust, those who are in the business of transport. has been touched upon by Chandrabhushan, that the cold areas are being repurposed, reclaimed, rehabilitated. Lot of eco park, reforestation, afforestation, water bodies have been created. Even horticulture is being done, agriculture is being done. However, there is a lot of untapped potential. In a few mines, extraction of sand from overburden is also a successful business. We have introduced commercial mining, and therefore there will be not many players other than central state PSUs and government companies. And the private companies will be having end use plant or may not be having any end use plant. So the spectrum of the coal miners is going to be very diverse and therefore poses a greater challenge. Let me add progressive mine closure. Per se, closing a mine and shutting it down. Yes, you are right that many times it is not appropriate to declare a closure. But as the mine progresses in its operation and production, progressive closure keeps happening. So it's not that the entire mine is left open. Open cast mines, there are a lot of progressive closure happening, and in the end, the final pit may remain. And about the GST, I must stress upon that whatever we had that environment cess has been subsumed in the GST. And there is a continuing GST compensation cess, but it requires GST council, of which states are also part. And again, in a federal setup, you require consensus building before you think of tapping into this resource. And among the stakeholders, let me also add that coal companies and coal-based industries will also be a stakeholder. They are diversifying into RE. Today, Naveli Lignite is a 1400 megawatt renewable energy company, and NTPC has already begun investing in RE. CIL is also intending into the business of solar, what we call solar energy, as also solar wafer making through PLI scheme of MNRE. CIL is also trying out clean coal technologies, coal gasification, and one project is already advertised and several others are in pipeline. So we are trying to move towards cleaner uses and cleaner technologies of the coal. And let me touch upon the land also. Land being a concurrent subject, it will continue to pose challenges in repurposing and reassignment. I mean, I don't want to tell much about it because the author of the new LARR Act is already here. Once acquired, it becomes a capital asset of the company. Land is value appreciating asset as compared to all other depreciating assets. So its return involves monies, and therefore there will be issues with accounting procedure, particularly when there is no incentive for returning the reclaimed land where more money is invested. Repurposing will involve further investment. It is said that in India, those businesses which do not require land flourish. Example being mobile technology. So wherever land is involved, it will be a difficult thing to move. Land lease as opposed to acquisition has the issue of rent, where rent is fixed very high, and therefore is also filled with uncertainties and physical condition of land to be at the time of the return. So all the coal companies, for that matter, all projects avoid taking land on lease. They tend to acquire. With JT in mind, the LA may need tweaking, but it has to make business sense to the companies involved in terms of land compensation and R&R expenditure. We at present are producing something like 700 million tons per annum from the domestic sources. And as per one estimate, direct and indirect employment is about 1 million people, whereas your report probably say 2 million, but as per the projection of Niti Aayog, by the time we reach 1600 million ton, there will be something like 2 million people employed in this sector. Finding alternate sources for livelihood, particularly in resource-scarce areas, is difficult even today. And with mining industries closer in mind, it would be even more difficult tomorrow. Scope for livelihood resources is limited and requires innovative thinking. By the time JT becomes inevitable, there will be massive logistic and coal evacuation infrastructure available in the coal-bearing areas. These two can be considered for generating livelihood options. Coal mine tourism has already been introduced in some of the areas by CIL. Though scope is limited, it gives glimpses of alternate sources and options for repurposing. Some efforts have been initiated. Let me come to the JT aspect within the government. That we have already initiated efforts to enhance our common understanding of the issues involved, improve our knowledge about the subject, and interact with experts for gaining insight and sensitization. And that is the reason I am here. With the help of agencies like IJTC, coherence of actions will be possible for achieving the larger objective. I would like to sum up with a message of hope that with challenge, although challenges are many, but there are also promises for the future. Therefore, the scope of work of IJTC is going to be vastly interesting and absorbing. I extend my best wishes to the IJTC in its endeavor to come up with the challenges. Thank you. Thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Vinodji. That was, I know you specified that these are your opinions, but that was a very informative session for all of us to understand what are the challenges and opportunities as well currently going ahead. I would now like to request Shri Jayant Sinha ji to speak a few words. And we all know that Jayanji is a member of parliament from Hazaribagh, which is also Hazaribagh constituency, which is also one of the key coal belts in India. He's also been very vocal about India meeting the net zero targets and decarbonization. So we open the floor to you, Jayanji, and look forward to hearing.
Thank you very much. And a very good evening to my colleague in Parliament, Shri Jairam Rameshji, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Coal, Shri Vinod Tiwari ji, Shri Partha Bhattacharya ji, former Chairman Coal India, my good friend and colleague, Shri Anshu Bhardwaj, leader of this great initiative, Shri Chandrabhushan ji, and all his colleagues at the iForest Center, friends, colleagues. I first of all want to thank the Just Transition Center and iForest for this exemplary initiative. It's very clear that we have to undertake a very major transition of not just our energy systems, but our economy over the next few decades. And while, of course, there are many things we need to do at the policy level and at the political level, at the end of the day, and I say this as a Lok Sabha member of Parliament, it is a human endeavor. It is an endeavor that affects crores of people, and they are used to a certain way of life, a certain way of earning their income. And they are going to have to, over the next few decades, really make very, very profound transformations in their way of life. So this is, at the end of the day, very much a human endeavor, an endeavor where we have to address the dreams, the hopes, the fears of crores of people. And this is the part that I think it's most important, and which, of course, iForest has been working on, and of course is at the core of the entire Just Transition. So thank you very much, Chandrabhushan ji and all your colleagues for taking on this very important task, which is going to be vital for our economy and for the well-being of our people going forward. As you all know, I have been writing and speaking quite extensively on the net zero pathway for India. At some level, the markets have already spoken on India's transition. And even we as policymakers debate some of the pros and cons of, whether we should go on a low carbon pathway or a net zero pathway. If you look at where the capital markets are, and if you look at what's happening in science and technology, if you look at what's happening in the larger business community, I think there you'll find most people have already decided that the world, and of course India as well, should be on a net zero pathway. And the announcements that have come recently from various companies about their plans, what capital markets and large investors around the world are saying about fossil fuels, the recent board actions that have taken place at Exxon and elsewhere, will tell you that the markets have already moved to a net zero type of future. And so we also in India have to start to think very carefully about what is it that we need to do to move towards a net zero future. Now, it's absolutely clear, and there's no doubt about it, that we are the victims of climate change, that it is entirely inequitable and unjust that India should be bearing so much of the negative impact of climate change, and that these costs have come upon us and upon our people. So it's entirely unjust. There's no question about it. That being said, it's also equally clear that if you look forward and you see what is happening with technology, with what is happening with investments, that we as an economy cannot afford to be a brown economy going forward. Green technologies, green sources of energy, green areas of production are becoming rapidly more productive, more efficient, and lower cost than brown technologies. So while climate justice and equity is a very important issue, and we need to keep on debating that, the reality is, if we want to think of it in terms of competitiveness, it is becoming increasingly apparent to us that if we want to have a competitive economy going forward, and at the same time, of course, deal with some of the negative impacts of air pollution and carbon emissions and so on, that it is very much in our own interest, actually, to get on a net zero pathway. Because if we want to build a hyper-competitive, sustainable economy, this is really the path that we should be on. And so my slogan has become net zero is net positive. Net zero is net positive, while the conventional view tends to think that if we get on a net zero pathway, it's actually going to not be as robust for India's growth and India's jobs. I actually think by investing in green technologies, by getting on a net zero pathway, it will actually be positive for India's economy and for job creation and for entrepreneurship in India. So net zero is not net negative for India. Net zero is actually net positive for India. And therefore, we really need to embark on this transition as quickly as possible. We have time to plan. We have decades to plan and get this right. But the future for our economy, the future for our country is to get to the green frontier, as I call it, to get to the green frontier. And when I say the green frontier, I mean it is the production possibility frontier, the frontier where we have the most advanced, sophisticated, competitive technologies that are available to us. But even as we do that, we have to do it in a way that is just and even for our people, provides them the opportunities and the jobs so that they can also undertake this transition. So it's absolutely necessary. I think competitive forces in the global economy are propelling us in that direction. At some level, even as we talk about climate justice and we talk about equity, we will almost have no choice but to move to those green technologies if we want an advanced competitive economy, if we want to get to 5 trillion, 10 trillion in GDP, go from $2,000 of GDP per capita to 4,000, 6,000, 8,000, we will almost have no choice but to go to the green frontier to get on the net zero pathway. So that is a strong imperative in my own personal view. And of course, these are my own personal observations. I think getting to the green frontier is going to be extraordinarily important. Now, how do we do that? There have been some efforts now, and I must thank Anshu and his team at Shakti, where we are beginning to look at this at an analytical and at a robust modeling way. So far, people like myself have been laying out hypotheses, have been laying out ideas as to how this might happen. But we need to dig in deep, and I speak as somebody who's a former energy economist and an energy modeler myself, which is how I got my own professional training and my first graduate degree in energy policy modeling. That unless we go in and start to take some of the most sophisticated models in the world, whether they're systems dynamics model, CGE models, input-output models to look at the macroeconomic implications, unless we start to put these models together where we combine the energy system and the modeling on the energy side on the one hand and the economic modeling on the other hand, and try and understand what a net zero pathway will look like relative to a low carbon pathway, and test the hypothesis whether net zero is positive or net zero is negative, we are not going to understand exactly how this transformation has to play out. So what we are starting to do now, and we hope to do as a first draft for COP26, is to lay out a net zero pathway for India, compare that to low carbon pathways, compare that to business as usual reference cases, and see whether the hypothesis that I'm advancing, which is that net zero is net positive, is indeed true. And when I say net zero is net positive, I mean it in terms of GDP growth, I mean it in terms of jobs, I mean it in terms of pollution, I mean it in terms of deaths avoided, and quality of life. So when you look at this set of output parameters, unless we go in and do some serious modeling and understand the interdependencies between all the various parameters that we're modeling, we will not know in a comprehensive way. But that doesn't mean this is a forecast. We all understand these are just scenarios, but it gives us a plausible range of outcomes and parameters that we need to analyze and look at to understand how all of this is likely to unfold. But even as we are doing this modeling work, friends, what is very clear that a net zero pathway or a low carbon pathway, as Chandrabhushan was already articulating in the IEA scenario, is going to require the retirement of fossil fuels and the replacement of fossil fuels by a variety of renewable energy sources, hydrogen and biofuels. That is central to any transition. That is central to us getting to a low carbon pathway or a net zero pathway. And here the numbers, as always, are instructive. Today, we know that globally, if you look at carbon equivalents, our total emissions globally are 55 billion tons today, 55 billion tons. They came down a little bit because of the COVID pandemic, but they've picked up again, and we're back at about that same rate of 55 billion tons of carbon emissions. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, many other august scientific bodies have opined that we have to go from 55 billion tons to zero by 2050 if we want to maintain global warming at no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade from pre-industrial revolution levels. Today, at 55 billion tons and growing, we are on a trajectory where instead of 1.5 degrees centigrade, or 2 degrees centigrade, which is the absolute outer limit, we are headed to 3 degrees centigrade. 3 degrees centigrade. So today, we've already warmed the global average temperature by 1 degree centigrade. The trajectory that we are on, current course and speed, business as usual reference case, is going to get us to 3 degrees centigrade. Now, since we are headed towards 3 degrees centigrade, we know what's going to happen to the Arctic. We know what's going to happen to the Antarctic. The latest evidence is that they are warming at some levels 3 times faster than people were expecting. So we are in a situation where the tipping effect, where some of the feedback effects that go along with climate change are accelerating faster than some of the models had picked up and some people had anticipated. Obviously, we in India, whether it's cyclones, whether it's glacial melting, whether it's flooding, whether it's droughts, all of these extreme weather events are ones that we are also experiencing. So climate change is happening fast. Climate change is something we have to deal with today. And as I said, to be able to get to zero from 55 billion tons, we have to start to make the transition as soon as possible. Now, what does this mean for India? Today, as I said, out of the 55 billion tons, India emits about 3.5 billion tons of carbon equivalent greenhouse gases. 3.5 billion tons. And the current course and speed, even with us overachieving our Paris commitments, which of course we are on track to do, and we are doing a terrific job in meeting our Paris commitments, most models are showing that we will be somewhere between 7 to 10 billion tons by 2050. So if the world has to get to zero, let me repeat, whether it's Bill Gates, whether it's the Intergovernmental Climate Change Panel, any one of them, all of them are saying that for us to get to 1.5 degrees centigrade of global warming by 2100, the world has to go from 55 billion tons to zero or very low single digits. Zero or very low single digits by 2050 to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Under current course and speed, India alone is going to go from 3.5 billion tons to between 7 to 10 billion tons or even more, depending on how the transition pans out. So the world can't get to net zero. The world can't get to a sustainable level of global warming unless India also gets to a very low level of carbon emissions. Now, we can argue on whether it should be 1 billion ton, 2 billion tons, but it can't be 8 or 10 billion tons if the rest of the world is headed towards zero. We have to find a way of doing this. Now, as I said right at the outset, we are already seeing, of course, that the market has already taken all of this into account. The market is viewing as 30-year out climate risks as being very significant and material, and they're starting to price that in. If I am writing a mortgage for 30 years, I'm going to start to think about 2050. So if I'm a financial institution and central banks around the world are already starting to price in climate risk, those investments that are going to be carbon positive or emitting carbon are going to have to pay much more for their capital than those investments that are going to be decarbonized. And so in this way, these forces have already begun to move, and these forces have already begun to take action in the global economy and in the Indian economy as well. And therefore, we are going to have to make the transition, we are going to have to make the transformation to a green economy. We are going to have to get to the green frontier. The good news in all of this, of course, is that we have many decades to prepare for this. We have many decades to prepare for this. But as we all know, these are long-lived, durable assets. And if we put them in the ground today, a coal mine, a power plant, a building will last for 30, 40, 50 years. So even as we have decades to prepare, we've got to start now. And at its core, as I said, this is not about policies. This is not about politics. This is about people. This is about helping people make, these very fundamental transformations in their life. And again, I want to thank, iForest for the work that they've done in Ramgarh, where they have identified how dependent population is on the coal economy and how much it drives their day-to-day life and their day-to-day activities. So we have to take these ideas of transition and transformation and bring it down to the grassroots. Now, when we bring it down to the grassroots, we realize that across India, from Assam, from Jharkhand, from Bengal, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, there is an entire mineral belt. There's a belt which Jairam Rameshji and others know very well, that is very dependent on the fossil fuel economy, on coal, minerals of various kinds, and so on. So we are talking about crores and crores of people that are going to have to undergo this transformation, right? And it's easy at some level to talk about it in Delhi. It's easy to talk about it in Delhi. It's very, very, very hard and difficult to deal with it in Hazaribagh. And the reason is because you have, crores of people that are used to a certain way of life, that are uncertain about their future, that are concerned and anxious about their future. And having dealt both with opening of very large coal mines, of course, in Badkagaon and elsewhere, and in Keridari block now that we are dealing with it, and also closure of coal mines, which again we've dealt with in Kuju, in Mandu, in Patratu. I have had experience both opening and closing of coal mines and the kind of human aspects associated with all of that. What I have learned in that process is that to build the trust of people and to gain their confidence and go through a transition that is a just transition, three principles are very important. First, we need to have a clear and honest roadmap. So people need to know over the next few decades what is going to happen to them. Where are they going to find, sustenance in terms of livelihoods? Where are they going to live? Where are their children going to go to school? And Mr. Bhattacharya knows this well, that, Coal India is a world unto itself. It's an ecosystem unto itself. It's got all kinds of welfare programs. It provides electricity. It provides water. It provides support for people, at a 25-kilometer radius around a coal mine. There's an entire ecosystem of people that are dependent on coal mining and other production activities associated with coal, like transportation and so on. So for this entire group of people, this entire ecosystem, we have to transparently tell them what's going to happen over the next few decades so they can prepare. Can they live in Coal India housing going forward? Will they get electricity from Coal India? Will they be able to go and pick out coal from the coal dumps and be able to sell that coal? How are they going to make their life going forward? So, number one, we need to provide them a roadmap. Number two, we need to give them alternatives. What are they going to do? How are they going to make a living going forward? What are their alternatives? How do we help them? Those alternatives, compensation, new ways of living, all that has to be explained to them in great detail. So, number one, what is the roadmap? How much time do they have? How does it impact their family? Number two, what is the compensation? How are they going to survive? What is going to happen to them? That's the second very important principle that we have to be clear about. And then the third is transparency. What really gets people anxious and frustrated is when, the Coal India or CCL general manager is sitting in his office with three people making decisions on the lives of thousands and thousands of people. They don't know what's happening. They are anxious. They are agitated about it. We will have a dharna. We will have shouting. We will have groups of people assembling in front of these offices because they don't know what's happening to their lives. And so whatever we do, however we go through this process, it has to be a participative, transparent process where the stakeholders have to be involved. It has to be something that they know about and they understand and that they can grapple with. But very often in our approaches, this is done behind closed doors. This is done in a secretive way. People don't understand. They don't understand the logic of what is happening, and that just creates more fear and anxiety. So I'll just conclude by saying that markets have spoken. India, for its own competitive economy, has to move towards a net zero pathway. That will require a very major transition and transformation of our economy, particularly in fossil fuels, particularly in coal. Ultimately, this will have to be something that is tackled at a human level. There are crores of people that are going to be impacted. And as we deal with that great transformation, and of course, we have a lot of time and decades to plan for it, the three principles we have to follow in this transition. Number one, we have to provide the roadmap so people understand what is happening to them. Number two, it has to take into account people's need for compensation, people's need for alternatives. And number three, it has to be a consultative, transparent, stakeholder-driven process so people feel like they have a voice, that their voices are being heard. And that is, in fact, Chandrabhushan and colleagues, a just transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jayanji. Those very important words on the inevitability of this energy transition and what it will entail for India. And obviously putting people at the heart of it, a very, very important thing to do there, because that's the biggest challenge as well. And we hope we can work around that to make people a central part of this transition. I will now request Shri Jairam Rameshji kindly say a few words. Jairamji is a member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, and I think one of his most cherished and well-known portfolios has been as the Union Minister of Environment and Forests. He's also been the Minister of Power and has been a very, very vociferous, negotiator for India on international platforms on climate change. So, Jairamji, floor is open to you.
Well, it'll really be a few words with the emphasis on few, because we've had a very comprehensive presentation by Tiwari-ji of the Ministry of Coal and an even more detailed exposition by my colleague and good friend Jayant Sinha. So there's very little I can add. I think Chandrabhushan has produced, and his team, of course, I should recognize the entire team that has produced this report. And it's really a report that needs to be discussed, not only at the central government, not only in Parliament, but with the state governments and at the local level, because this is a path on which we don't have the option of staying away from this path. We have to be on this path, the path of low carbon, net zero, by the time that we are all dead. Because, it's very easy to say we'll be net zero by 2050. I don't think anybody, Chinmay will be alive, Chandrabhushan may be alive, but I certainly won't. So it's very easy to give a target for 2050. So I find these are meaningless exercises. What is more important is to have the roadmap. What's more important is to have the intermediate milestones, the 2-year, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year milestones. Anything beyond 10 years, I begin to switch off. Really, we can have an aspirational pathway, but we also have to have a pathway to which we hold ourselves accountable. There must be some degree of accountability to what we say. So I think this report is a good starting point. The issues are very complex. There are organizational issues. There are federal issues involved here. There are financial issues involved here. And ultimately, as Jayant said, overarching, fundamentally, there are human issues involved here. And those have to be resolved not in a technocratic way, but they also have to be resolved, addressed as part of our political process. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge ahead of us. But to inform that resolution in the political process, you need analysis, you need analytical work, you need reasoned work. And I think this is a step in the right direction. There have been some earlier other reports going back to the low carbon group report that came out in 2014. And subsequently, incidentally, when that report came out, low carbon was a bad word in this country. And today's champions of low carbon in 2014 thought that low carbon was some giant Western plot to keep India in a state of perennial underdevelopment. But today it's now the conventional wisdom. And I think it's established consensus, and you won't find anybody arguing today against a low carbon pathway. So I think the issues that Chandrabhushan and his team have raised in relation to the coal industry, particularly, very, very important. And of course, one factor that we need to keep in mind is that however aggressive we are and however successful we are in meeting our renewable targets, short of some phenomenal revolution in energy storage, which could well be on the horizon, we will still need for baseload electricity generation, particularly, we'll need fossil fuels. So India is not going to be in a position to realistically make a commitment on phase out of fossil fuels. We can certainly make a commitment on phase down of fossil fuels. And what that rate of phase down should be, of course, is will be accelerated. And in this scenario, the role of nuclear is very, very important. We don't normally look at the nuclear option, but the success we have in ramping up our nuclear capacity, to that extent, the pressure on our coal resources gets reduced. So I think that's something that we need to look at as when we look at these just transitions. I know nuclear is a touchy issue because environmentalists, nuclear is the red rag to the green bull. The environmentalists are not the great environmentalists, advocates of net zero, low carbon. They see red when they hear the word nuclear. But the fact is that the nuclear option is an option that India can ill afford to give up at this stage. Maybe 10 years from now, this may not be the scenario. So let me congratulate once again Chandrabhushan for producing very, very deep, well thought out, very well argued document. I will certainly have this circulated to all members of my Standing Committee on Environment and Forests and Climate Change, which also includes science and technology, by the way. So I'll have this circulated very quickly. And when Parliament opens or reopens on the 19th of July, we'll try to have an evening where you make a presentation to the members. A lot of members from Assam, Jharkhand, Odisha, Bihar. They'll all have questions on how this just transition should be. And then let's take the debate forward. I think it's important to take this debate forward. It's important to engage in these debates. We've moved a long distance in the last 10 years. And I think that's a great development that has taken place in India. And I think we should capitalize on this. And I will only end by saying that what India must do must not be dictated by COP26 or COP27 or COP28. What India must do must be determined autonomously. We must do it because it is in our interest. We must do it because we have to do it. Otherwise we have the maximum vulnerabilities. So we should not link whatever we do, to the vagaries of international negotiations. We should do what we have to do, which is in our interest to do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jairamji, for putting that India perspective into the picture. And like you said, it has to be a phase down first and then eventually a phase out. And we have to look at our developing targets as well when we look at just transition. Now we are over to the second part of this evening. And I'd request Mr. Shirish Sinha to please take over from me and moderate the next half. Just to have a brief introduction, Mr. Sinha is the Director Climate at Children Investment Fund Foundation, CIF, and his work concerns clean energy and decarbonization in power, looks at transport and electric mobility, sustainable finance, climate policy, possibly all the gamut of sustainability and climate that we've been talking about right now. He has a huge experience of about 25 years in policy and planning around sustainability and climate. And Shirishi, please, the floor is yours. Please take over, and I'll be around for anything that is needed anyway. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chinmay, and thank you. And once again, congratulations to iForest team, CB, and Shrestha for an excellent report and for a very fabulous inaugural session. I think the key recommendations and the speakers that they've talked about have just set the context for this panel discussion to happen around just transition. The way we will structure this panel is it's in two parts: a short presentation from Shrestha to bring out what are the 5 major recommendations, the 5 R's, which the title of this report is. And then we will open it up to the panelists who have been distinguished panelists who is available for us to comment on this report, but also bring forward their perspective on it. I just wanted to kind of set the context of this panel in terms of saying that, at SIF, as a philanthropic foundation working on issues of cross-cutting issues of children and climate, we have started to realize that as we deepen our engagement on energy transition across our thematic areas, but also in terms of our geographies and countries that we work in, we feel that there is a need for a coherent narrative to embed the principles of what we call as a socially just transition. And this should be across all our climate investment. And as we promote more of these transitions towards net zero or a low carbon economy, and we saw a fairly detailed assessment that Mr. Jain Sinha provided of the different ways that carbon budget analysis needs to look at, we have to recognize that these interventions will impact lives, these interventions will impact livelihoods, and also the social structures, especially as this report really talks about. There are 16 states, districts, 60 districts across the country, which will have a huge implication that we need to look at. So we need to deepen our understanding to understand what the existing inequalities are there and make sure that as this transition happens, and irrespective of the time frame, whether this happens in next 10 years, 15 years, or 20 years, which is the time, as Mr. Sinha and Mr. Jairam Ramesh were mentioning, is available on our hand to plan for these. We make sure that we leave no one behind as these transitions are really going to happen. So, in fact, if I have to say that, I want to thank the iForest team. Much of our thinking internally within SIF and the climate team, actually, the trigger was the report that the iForest did for us last year on just transition in India, and it reignited the debate. I mean, it was conversations were happening, but we were never giving enough focus on it. And I think that has really led to a new conversation happen. And this new report on 5 R's, it actually further deepens our understanding by applying it to make it more cross-sectoral landscape and also look at more sectors as well as the geographies in which we need to focus. So we will discuss the recommendations and findings of the report with the panelists. But I first would like to invite Shrestha to make a brief presentation. And Shrestha, request is that if you could keep it around 10 minutes, that will give us a good set of time for discussion with the panelists to come. And what I'll do is that just before, 2 minutes before your time is over, I'll just give you a signal so that you need to wrap up. So Shrestha, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Sirish. And I'll do it in a very sharp, and I'll try to be concise, because I feel the opening session, all of our speakers and guests have spoken on many of this. So basically, this report, I would say that it is more of an exploration in nature rather than a conclusion. And because we are not have restricted to one sector of fossil fuel, of coal, which was our earlier study, but we have looked into the various fossil fuel sectors, coal, oil, and gas, as well as sectors which are really dependent on them, heavily dependent on them, and also a significant source of GHG emissions. So with that, I'll start. So the report, what it broadly covers, and the goal of the report was to understand what will be the impacts of a fossil fuel phase down in the coming decades. And what we mean by impact, we looked into 3 parameters, which will be the spatial impact, such as the impact on states and districts and which regions, the impact on the workforce, as well as what will be the issues with public revenue. And the sector that its reports look into is coal, oil, and natural gas. There is thermal power, steel, cement, We have looked into refineries and also the marketing and distribution component of the oil sector, the road transport, another major emitter, and in fertilizer, we have specifically focused on urea, given the green global warming potential of this sector. And finally, what the name of the report, we have highlighted 5 critical elements that will be important for just transition to be considered in the coming 3 to 4 decades for India. This CB broadly touched upon, so I will just briefly say that one of the guiding things in this our way to think was that the energy transition pathway will be determining for how we plan our just transition in the coming decades. And the report has evaluated 2 models, which is one is proposed by the International Energy Agency, which is looking at a net zero pathway by the mid-2060s. And the other is by Terry and Shell, which has also come up this year, which is looking at a net zero pathway by 2050. And what essentially comes up from this 2 report is that we need a significant and very, very drastic reduction in coal demand and oil demand. The first one, the IEA report has only said about coal till 2050, and iForest does a projection beyond 2040. It goes into 2050, where the demand actually reduces by 85%. And for the Terry and Shell report, in fact, there is a 60% reduction demand for coal and oil that has to happen in the next 30 years. So in this context, it becomes very, very significant that how we plan this just transition and for which sectors. Now, when we looked into sectors, 2 were key elements that we thought of. One is, of course, the greenhouse gas emission contribution as share of India total, and what is the feasibility of the sectors for transition, which is largely technology readiness or any other mechanisms that can help for a transition. And in this graph, in the horizontal axis, we have plotted the GHG emission percentages, and in the horizontal axis, actually, the years of technology readiness. And what comes off very clear is the biggest bubble that we have here is the coal-based power sector, which in fact is ready for transition because of RE boom. And the transition is going to happen somewhere in the 5 to 7 years time scale. The other major sector will be, of course, the coal mining sector, which is very intricately related to the power sector. So the demand will go down, and we are in a right position to start thinking about that, as Jayanji and CV had already pointed out. And then there is another important sector, which is the road transportation sector, because of the EV transition that we are envisioning, the government of India is supporting through policies and funds. And that transition, in fact, in the road transport sector, I'll come to it, we have broken into 2 parts in the report. So basically, the coal mining, coal-based power, and the road transport sector will experience major disruptions in the next 10 years. It will be not that every coal mining will go away or power plant will go away, but the starting point is very near. For coal mining, what we have focused on is immediate planned closure of underground and low profitable mines and the mines that are coming to end of life. And in the next 3 decades, we can have a phase down as per the net zero pathway alignment. The coal-based power, of course, will be phased down and ultimately closure. For road transport, electrification of 2 and 3 wheelers and passenger cars is currently the biggest emphasis given the technology and the policy push behind him and the finances that are coming in. But for the freight transport, the time frame is a little shifted. It is at least for 15 years that we have looked into thinking of a combination of alternative fuel sources, such as it can be natural gas, it can be biofuels, it can be, of course, electric. And the other major sectors that we have looked into is steel, cement, and of course, urea fertilizer, where we think that the transition will start hitting in somewhere around the 2030s, early 2030s, late 2020s, depending on the technological disruptions that we see in these sectors. Now, with respect to a spatial impact, that's what Sirish just highlighted. If we look across these 8 sectors that we have considered in this report, and just look at the top districts where the sectors are concentrated, there are 120 districts which are dependent on this fossil fuel and carbon intensive industries, which will be impacted in the next 3 decades. And then if we look into the 10-year picture scenario, which is most interesting, and Jairamji is saying we need to have a clear roadmap with intermittent goals, here comes in the picture where the biggest focus will be 60 districts. And for the reason, because here we have the concentration of coal, here we have the concentration of coal-based power. So a lot of time there is an overlap between the two. And finally, the automobile districts, particularly considering the manufacturing of automobile and automobile components. And if I further try to zoom in and streamline it, of course, India's heartbeat in the states of Jharkhand, Orissa, and Chhattisgarh will be the major focus that has to happen. But in Maharashtra and Gujarat, also given the oil and in Maharashtra, the automobile industry, these are some of the states also that will be significant. With respect to the workforce impact, the most interesting part, and this is a data that we went by various resources to put together. For the formal, we went by the annual survey of industries, we went by employment factor assessment, we took some of the thumb rules such as put by the CA, and overall what the picture that has come out is the informal employment is nearly 4 times the formal employment if we combine all these sectors. And for informality, of course, there is no clear data, and with the beginning, Vinodji told our estimates differ from the coal ministry. But what we have largely relied on is the NSSO survey of the 68th round, which gave a broad proportion of formal and informality in various sectors. And that is the thumb rule we broadly went by. Now, for me, I feel that the informality is still underestimated here because particularly in Eastern India's coal regions, if we go, we have a huge section of subsistence coal economy where they are the coal gatherers and sellers. And the Ramgarh study that we initially mentioned actually highlighted that. So this number doesn't even capture that volatility or uncertainty in the sector for the transition. But definitely the key point here is that there must be a key focus and a major focus on how we transition the informal sector and what we do about them. With respect to the third component was the revenue impact. Now here the biggest one of the biggest finding was, and we personally went by looking into, of course, literature, but going by company records, particularly of PSUs for coal and CPSCs for the oil sector. And what is coming out is the bigger challenge will be for the oil and gas sector revenue substitution than the coal sector. In fact, the oil and gas sector revenue share is nearly 10 times the coal revenue when it comes to our government exchequer contributions overall. So here is the big challenge. And when we talk of just coal mining direct revenue, and we have looked into 8 top coal states, all the PSU annual accounts, and broadly, this is about 5 to 6% of the total revenue is in the coal states comes from coal mining. So this is something that is there. And the biggest share of this state revenue is, of course, the royalty. And Vinodji already spoken about district mineral foundation funds. So these two are the major funds available with the state. And finally, in fact, what is interesting is apart from states like Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, the state revenue share from just oil and petrol taxes, taxing just the diesel and petrol is much higher than what is getting from coal. Like Madhya Pradesh is a classic example, which this number is showing Orissa. And if I go into Maharashtra, it is nearly much higher. So the key question right now is, for the states will be, I think, going ahead, the challenge of revenue substitution will be far bigger if we only consider the direct revenues. Of course, I'm not going to the indirect revenues right now. So given this overall scenario of workers' impact, spatial distribution, as well as the revenue question, we have identified 5 critical elements that will be important for a just transition. And there's a broad areas we have identified. Of course, the planning will be much granular. And we have called it 5 Rs, the name of the report itself. So the first one will be the restructuring of the economy and the industries that will be necessary. Second is repurposing of the land and infrastructure. Third, definitely reskilling of the existing workforce. And of course, considering the new industries that will come in, the renewable energy, battery production that will happen, will need to skill a lot of new workforce. There will be questions of revenue substitution, which will be most important, and how do we finance a just transition, in fact. And finally, responsible social and environmental practices must happen. We cannot continue with the business as usual scenario, because just transition is both a consideration and better social practices as well as environmental practices. Few things I'll just highlight. When we talk of restructuring the economy on the industries, the major industrial restructuring, as we think, if we think just of the coal mining sector, the power sector, as well as the automobile sector, which the highlights for the next 10 years, the states where this must happen is Jharkhand, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, and Gujarat. And in some of the mono-industry coal districts, actually a far important micro-planning will be necessary. And we have looked into micro-level data for some of the districts like Korba district of Chhattisgarh, or Dhanbad district of Jharkhand, Angul district of Odisha, and everywhere the picture is about 77% or above of the district population is dependent on coal mining and coal-based power. And I'm not even going into the vast informality that is there.
I need to request you to please wrap up. Thanks.
So, with respect to repurposing of land and infrastructure, we have about 4.5 million hectares of land available with coal mining and major coal-allied sectors, such as steel, cement, and power. And in fact, the coal and coal power sector share is about 37% of this land. So land reclamation and redevelopment will be a huge opportunity to create long-term and short-term income opportunities, and reform in land laws, which we already discussed. Reskilling and retraining, every sector will necessarily require this, and I'm not going to go into the detail. But for coal and the power sector, of course, besides reskilling and retraining, we'll need to create alternative jobs. There will be issues of pension that must be dealt with. There will be some transition funds that has to be supported. And finally, the key issue will be the government intervention for the informal workers. And this is something, a policy decision that has to be made at the state and the center. With respect to revenue substitution, the biggest opportunity we hope today is at hand is District Mineral Foundation Fund. Currently, coal mining districts have about 184 billion. And in fact, just 25 top coal districts have 88% share of it. So this is a huge opportunity for micro planning. And then, of course, the GST compensation says we don't know the future of it, but if it comes to an end in the year 2022, currently the estimates are that about 400 billion is there. So these two funds are definitely an opportunity to tap in the immediate future. Finally, talking of socially responsible practices, of course, inclusive planning will be necessary, capturing the needs and aspirations of people. And one of the things we have highlighted is we need to reverse the resource curse, and investment with social infrastructure is going to be hugely important, because there are huge proportion of multidimensionally poor people in these coal districts. What it means is they have extremely poor living standards, they have extremely poor indicators of health as well as education. So that will be very high. And of course, that will help to build social resilience. And at the end, we think environmental responsible practices must be promoted, because of course, mine closure will be there. But the basic idea is that if we can do proper ecological protection and restoration in these areas, it can be significant, because many of the coal areas are also tribal regions. They have huge forest potential. In fact, some of the coal district has double the average forest cover of India. So these people can be more readily absorbed in this economy instead of putting them in a completely different world. Watershed development, in the next session, we can hear some of the districts are already doing through DMFT funds, as well as enhancing the agricultural potential through investments in irrigation in this area.
Please.
So, Sirish, I'm done. This was the last point, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Sirish. I'm sorry, I don't like to rush people, but there's very less time left for the panelists. So what I'll do is that I'm sure there will be questions on your presentation. There's one, so I'll request all the people who are attending the session, please use the chat function. The Q&A is there. There are some questions already there. Please put more. So if the team is not able to respond today, I'm sure they will get back to everyone with their response. So without any further to do, I would like to invite Mr. Partha Bhattacharya, who is the director with the Haldia Petrochemicals and also the former chairman of the Coal India Limited. So my request to you is if you could keep it to about 5 to 6 minutes. I know if I need to adjust everybody in the remaining 30-minute slot. One question that I just wanted to raise it to you as you respond. You represent the industry which is under tremendous pressure right now. And it's really looking at, as Mr. Jain Sinha said, the pressure on the fossil fuel industry is really there. Market signals are clearly showing that there is a need for phase out to happen. So if in your remarks, if you could reflect on how the transition or the just transition can play out in fossil fuel industries like coal and oil and gas, and how can this be more just and socially relevant, which is one of the recommendations that is coming out from this report. So over to you for your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Honorable Sri Jairam Rameshji, MP and Minister during my time. He was the Forest Minister, MOEF, and then earlier to that, the Power Minister. We had some nice interactions at that time, which he was remembering as well. Sri Jain Sinha ji, MP, Chandrabhushan ji, and the other members of the I-Forest team. I think one point that was very clearly stressed during the by the earlier speakers was the need for a very transparent and proper communication. That is very central to the transition happening in a just manner. Now, I find a lot of problem in that area. Problem because just now the presentation that Shrestha did, which showed the IEA outlook for coal, it suggests that by 2030, we should be consuming 10% less coal than what we are doing today. 500 something, I think it is in terms of oil equivalent or whatever, and that goes down to 454. Whereas the formal official position of the Ministry of Coal and Coal India is just the reverse. Coal India is being told to increase its production from 600 million tons to 1 billion ton. The dateline earlier was 2024, now it is 2026. And as the Additional Secretary pointed out, the total consumption today is about close to 1 billion ton, which should go up to 1.6 billion ton in 2030. So this and the IEA picture or the other picture that was shown was completely a divergence. Now, if the coal companies and coal miners are being told that you are supposed to increase your production by 60% from current levels by 2030, I mean, they will not even visualize any kind of transition. It will be very difficult for them to even visualize that. So I think there is a need really to for the official position to be properly calibrated and corrected. Because one thing is very clear, we are not going to add any coal-based power capacity just because of economics. Today, solar power has come down to 2 rupees or 2 rupees 20 paisa, etc. And the tariff from a new coal-based capacity is not going to be less than 3 rupees 50 paisa. So there is no question of adding fresh coal-based capacity. So all the demand of coal that will fan out will be from the existing thermal power plants and a little bit of coal for gasification, which is being talked about. We are talking about 100 million ton gasification, and I'm really not very clear because the economics is not getting clear. You see, gasification, whether it is a financially viable proposition, what people are saying is that gasification products are market related. They will be sold at market related prices, but they are expecting input raw coal to be at 20% less than the price at which power. That doesn't work. If the gasification is not standing on its own economics, it doesn't work. So I have a little doubt about the 100 million. The third point is the 100 million tons of import to be substituted by domestic coal. Now, imported coal is of a different quality, is of a different variety, it is high calorific value, and we don't make that kind of coal. Our coal is high ash, low calorific value. So unless we are ready to set up large number of washeries, I think even that 100 million ton is unlikely. As far as the existing power plants are concerned, although the PLF is low, and there is definitely a scope of PLF going high, but since you have a lot of tailwinds on solar, solar is a must draw kind of a thing. Solar has all kinds of capital related subsidies, all kinds of waiver of transmission, T&D losses, etc. And you have conversely huge headwinds on coal. You have this 400 rupees GST compensation cess. You have a railway tariff
which is unheard of, highest in the world in terms of rupees per rupees per ton kilometer. It is one of the highest. And we have a structure of royalty and cess in the country, which is also one of the highest in the world. So ultimately, in the destination price, coal price is just about 25 to 30% in most cases. The rest is all these kind of charges. So with these kind of charges, with the GST compensation cess, with no funding coming for coal-based projects, I think coal is already being taken to a dead end. And in that situation, to talk about a 60% increase in coal consumption, I think is a dichotomy. So we need to correct the communication scale. I mean, it has to be integrated and consistent with each other. That is my first point. Second point that I want to leave it with the question that you had asked, that how to make it a little more smoother and, instead of bumpy, can we make it smoother? You see, there is a big scope because of the structure of coal industry. Coal industry has one section which is basically a legacy section. The legacy part is one that we acquired at the time of nationalization. And these are all small mines. Small underground mines, mostly underground mines. Very low productivity, high manpower kind of mines. And some of that has been closed, but some of that still remains. And that's quite a big number. Out of the mines that we created post-nationalization, the earlier smaller mines, some of them open cast, are also incurring losses. I mean, are also on the dying phase. But some of the bigger mines, they are there, they are staying. In fact, today the structure is, we produce about 95% coal from open cast, which is about 550 million tons. I'm talking about only Coal India, not the All India thing. And out of this 550 million tons, only 17 mines, they contribute 335 million tons. That's about 60%. These are the large mines. Each of them is more than 10 million tons. In fact, 3 of them are more than 40 million tons. So these are real big size mines. The rest number of mines, which is about 141 or so, they are of mixed sizes, but largely open cast. They can stay on for quite some time. But what we don't really need is something like 160, 70 very old, loss-making, underground, mostly underground, few open cast mines as well. These are the mines where the engagement of people is more than 1 lakh. 1 lakh people work in those mines, which is about 45% of the current manpower, 42, 43% of the current manpower. These mines collectively produce only 5 to 6 million tons of coal. That's all their production. So we don't know what to do with the manpower. That's why the mines are there. That is the broad fact. And the aggregate loss that these mines incur is a staggering 16,000 crores a year. That is roughly the profit that Coal India makes in a year. So actually Coal India's profit is 32,000 crores, of which 16,000 crores is eaten up by these 150, 160 mines, highly loss-making mines. So I think these mines are getting closed by default. Either there is a safety problem somewhere, or people have all exited or retired or something like that. So it is getting closed, or some problems is getting closed. I think we should go for a planned closure. We should take up at least 10% of these mines every year. 20, 30 mines closing is not a big task. And I'm happy to say that Coal India recently, in the last chairman statement, he did mention about closure of 23 mines, which is quite a good number. So at that pace, if these 200 mines can be closed in the next 10 years' time, phased out, so that would mean that we are actually off with a large number of manpower problems. More than 100,000 people will be taken care of. And the land, those particular areas, this 170 mines closure, that area will become available. A lot of land will become available that can be, it can be restored, reclaimed, and made to be used for different purposes, if not for anything, for deep afforestation. At least that could be one good purpose, creating some good ecological parks and things like that. So I think with that process, we'll be done away with a large part of the transition in terms of manpower numbers, because the rest of the mines that we have, together they have not more than 100,000 people, although they produce such a big tonnage. But that is basically mechanized mines. And as the time comes, closure of mechanized mines, less manpower will not be that big a problem. We should be able to handle that. So I think the first task that we should take up is, first of all, to set the communication proper and make an integrated approach. What should be communicated? I don't think the two communications are synchronizing well. So that is one. And second thing is to take up this faster transition, plan closure of these highly loss-making mines. We should be through with this. And in that process, what will happen is we'll be creating a more consolidated and financially strong coal India, which can then take care of the further transition. You know, you need money for that. You need investments for that. So a large part of that investments can come from Coal India itself, because it will become financially strong once these mines are taken off. I think I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much. This was such a brilliant points, and two very important that you mentioned. I won't repeat for time, but yes, communication and plan closure, and to look at it. But my only point, and I think since this is just a debate that we're just starting, and we should have more of these conversations, even though we do this plan closure with this existing old, unprofitable, unviable mines, there are still a large number of informal workforce that may still be dependent. And what do we do? The one which are part of the Coal India Limited and others would be taken care of, but what happens to the informal workforce and labor force will still be dependent on. But thank you so much, Mr. Bajaj. It's excellent points that you made. I will move on to our next speaker, which is Mr. Nikhil Pawan Kalyan, who is the Collector and District Magistrate of Sundargarh in Odisha. And Mr. Kalyan, you have been reflecting with your long experience in the district, looking at the intersection of coal. The district is extremely very well placed in terms of the kind of transition discussion and debate that we are happening, both in terms of the mining that happens for coal and iron ore, the steel and thermal power production. And at the same time, the district has very wide land use as well as forests, which brings significant issues in terms of just transition. So my question to you, and it's very what I want to ask is that how do we plan for just transition, and how are you approaching the just transition plan in a district like Sundargarh, and also looking at aspects of livelihood diversification and socio-economic development? And from your experience, because the district earns a lot of revenue from the district mineral fund, how can that be being used for a bottom-up planning that is required at the district level? So, Mr. Karan, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. At the outset, I will thank honorable members of Parliament who have been part of the program, Additional Secretary and all the ex-seniors, and the President of iForest and all the team. Thanks a lot for this discussion. It has brought up some good points for discussion. As you mentioned, I would like to bring in whatever small points that I can bring to the forum from the field that we have been working upon. As you mentioned, we have a significant amount of coal mines in the district, and we do get a good amount of revenue under DMF recently in the last 3-4 years. And there is a lot of scope to ensure transition, irrespective of the policy level decisions at what happens and whether it will be closed or not. There is a lot of scope for a transition and ensuring just environment for the people in this area. Whether it is DMF or otherwise, also it is a responsibility for all of us to ensure the tribal people, as it is always more or less common that wherever mines are there, we have forests and we have the lifestyle discussion that comes up. So I have jotted down few points also that I thought I should bring up. So I'll go one by one. Mining employment, as specifically mentioned, coal mining employment is reasonably high. We also have made a survey at our level, again from DMF, and we understood that there is not many people actually working in the mining, because it is always open cast and it is here at least, and it is done through machinery. But yes, there is a huge number of people, especially the localites, working in the transport part of the mining. And we have very less washeries. So that is one thing which we really have to come up with. Not many ancillary industries have come up to make washeries. But yes, we have to ensure the transition of this transport, the employment that is provided through the transport. So the local economy is heavily dependent, yes, and revolves around the mining economy. So if we are doing the transition, we have to ensure that it is complete. I mean, why I say it is complete is when we started the mining, when we started the coal industries and the power sector also, we do have power plants of NTPC. Already they are in a transition phase from a before non-mining and non-industry phase to a phase where now the mines and industries are running. that transition itself is not yet 100% complete. So when we are talking of again transition to going back to non-mining and non-industry phase, the people have to be extremely taken into confidence, because we have already taken one or two generations into confidence and went ahead. Again, it will take one or two generations to again bring back or take their confidence while we decide, while any decision that happens at the policy level in this regard. Again, transportation, again, even though irrespective of the transition of the industry or the mining sector as a whole, the existing transporting itself can see a transition within the existing environment. For example, the NERI report, which is our Bible for ensuring the environmental impacts and ensuring the pollution levels are taken care of. The NERI report says conveyor belts, the NERI report says extreme measures to tackle transportation. Even though we are working very hard, we do require technology inputs and the research inputs and essentially the information exchange to ensure the inputs like the NERI report are actually being implemented. We do enforcement, we do enforce things at the field, but that is not at all going to be sufficient unless we have a paradigm shift in the actual way of bringing the right kind of technology to ensure that the transportation mechanism can actually be totally removed from the entire story, which itself will also take care of the other part that you were mentioning regarding the oil sector, because I have around 15,000 vehicles on road as we speak in the entire district, not only the coal sector. I have limestone and iron sector as well, but 15,000 heavy vehicles per day is my movement, which can drastically be reduced if the right transition options can be explored. And unfortunately, when I'm trying to do the enforcement for transportation, DMF, even though it has been a very untied way of doing things, I have been restricted not to allow for going for enforcement for transportation, which is very surprising. I would hope that the policy changes come up in this regard. I need to help DMF to use and restrict and enforce and provide probably technological inputs to ensure the transportation can be made into a less environmental impactful aspect. Similarly, the agriculture, we have been trying to ensure the livelihood of the mining people, where the mining activities and the energy activities happen, to transition them from mining activities, if whatever small number of people are there, to agriculture or allied activities, or increasing their income so that their dependency on the mines actually come down. We do have taken up a lot of initiatives under DMF for increasing the irrigation, especially such kind of irrigation activities where we are not exploiting again more and more the nature by digging bore wells or by just dragging water, whatever aquifer is there, but more of renewable and rechargeable options, mainly through ensuring the aquifers are understood, the topography is understood. So yes, DMF is actually helping in significantly getting the expertise from outside wherever it is already established, and we were able to slowly we have used SCADA technology to have canal irrigation without exploiting the nature. So the work is in progress. Yes, DMF definitely helps, thanks to the mining money, agreed. But yes, we need more of technological inputs and research advisors so that we can actually take up the work at the field. As I said, I just diverge. The capacity to even handle such huge amounts of funds is extremely important to understand. At the district level, the capacity has to really go up. We have been trying to increase. We are a lot better compared to 3 years back. Our capacity has dramatically increased. But yes, I still feel that there is a definite chance to increase the capacity more and more in terms of knowledge and technology. Resource curse, I have been following up the discussion. Yes, we do feel while working in the field also, whether our resources are our own curse or whether we are able to convert that. The transition has to also happen from the understanding from the people. Again, the policy advocacy has to come through the people, because as I see, even from DMF, none of the projects that we take more or less at many places have not even gone to the Gram Sabha level, which we were able to do. I have almost completed 2,900 projects duly approved by the Gram Sabha, by the people, by advocacy, and ensuring that the resource curse actually transfers itself into a decision making by the community itself. So yes, resource curse is a definite issue, but we do have options at our hand, and we really have to start working on it. And I'm very sure the transition can happen in a decade, even well before the policy level decisions can come up at our level. Capacity in terms of fund is there. Capacity in terms of information technology as part is still far cry. Institutional commitment related to research. I have been trying to get in touch with national and international issues like coal research institutes or the Benares universities or the Dhanbad universities, but there is no structured way of dealing with it. There is no structured way of transferring of technology or inputs, which we really require. And environmental improvement. I mean, even though we are doing mining and other coal and other iron, coincidentally or otherwise, the forest growth is increasing in the district. The data showed from your own presentation was 44%, which was last year. It is around, I think, increased by 6 points to 50. So we were able to actually use the existing opportunities through DMF, through either increasing the forest growth, plantation, going to organic manure and reducing the use of pesticides. Again, for the organic manure, we have extremely tough policy level restrictions where I cannot even sell the organic manure that's coming out because there is a 3-year bar. So even the transitions that we discussed, if we can hit out these points, the NERI reports, the information movement, the policies for selling and using manure at the lowest level, these can actually make a huge difference even before the transition of the entire sector comes up. So I hope we can actually do it. There are a lot of things that we can definitely do. As we always say, fund is never a problem. This is actually true in our case. Fund is not a problem. We do require help. We do require capacity building, because criticism is a very easy thing. DMF ka kam, you are using this and that. But yes, if we can get that kind of help for formulating an action plan, especially for the mining affected districts, I think we will be able to go a long way in actually starting this effect of transition for the right kind of people, because the GST is the amount of economy, that movement, sector movement from oil to other, might not actually go to the tribal people whom we are talking about unless these steps at the field are actually done. So yeah, I thought few points I should mention.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Kalyan. This is very good. And I think you rightly said. I mean, what is needed is capacity building support. Resource, at least funds are not really an issue. And the kind of planning and support that at the district level it can come. And I will pose this point to our last speaker before we come, and so that he could also address this. Our next speaker is Dr. Suranjali Tandon. She's an assistant professor with the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. Ms. Suranjali, you've been working extensively on issues of just transition, especially the key aspect of financing just transition. And you just heard Mr. Kalyan talk about that funds are not really an issue. It's just the work around capacity building and the technical support that is needed. This report also talks about revenue substitution and investment as one of the R's of the 5 R's that they're talking about. So my question to you, your reflection of from the work that you've been doing, given the complexity of just transition in India, and the different cross-sectoral issues of socioeconomic impact, what would be the kind of few recommendations you would like to bring forward related to financing of the just transition work in India? Suranjali, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Shirish. I would like to congratulate iForest on a wonderful report. Just flipping through it, I felt like, every sort of chart deserves attention and can be used judiciously by anyone working on just transitions. Of course, leaving aside the broader issues of, having a national plan, which I think Mr. Ramesh talked about, staggering those plans over years, and Mr. Sinha spoke of saying there should be a net zero plan. And I think these are good ways to relay what finance is required to do. And working over the last year or so, my understanding is that there are 2-pronged impacts that we will see of just transition. One, which the iForest report touches on very briefly, but I think needs more elaboration, is on the loss of tax revenue. I mean, even if you look at the COVID-19 situation, a lot of the tax revenues really came from oil, which accrues to the center. And, there are other issues in terms of fiscal federalism, which I do not wish to dwell on. But definitely, if we're saying that just transitions is an umbrella concept under which the SDGs are located, and so is the climate transition. The funding requirement will continue, in my opinion. So for that, the government has to think of innovative ways to raise additional money. And just saying simply carbon taxes is not enough, because that scope is already, I think, overutilized. So where are we going to get that finance? I think the other thing is that private investors usually ask, what is just transitions, and where do we put the money, and what is the change that will happen, right? So I think this report does a good job. We have India's map with all the districts sort of pinned down on where we are seeing that there will be a shift. And I think that is a good way to engage with private sector to show that, look, if you have assets here, you have invested in companies that are located and in these sectors, there is a potential downside, even for the banking sector, for example. So if there's going to be stranded assets or there's going to be a shock, you're going to have to pay in terms of your own money. So I think the key issue is to sort of measure and relay this risk, and I think this report takes the first step in doing that, which is I think great. So I think those are my two thoughts on how finance will be affected and can sort of be calibrated in the future to address the issue.
Thank you, Suranjali. You also made life much easier for me by limiting your time to much shorter than that. No, but I think good point. And I think we need to look at the kind of compensation that needs to be worked out if you really move out from fossil fuel industry, which is the major source of revenue flows for the government, and then planning, which can essentially include based on the initial work that the iForest team has currently done. Great. Thank you so much. I'm moving to our final panelist, and which is Dr. Anshu Bhardwaj, who is the CEO of Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation. Anshu, you are one of the leading experts on energy policy in the country. And therefore, one of my questions, and it builds on something that Mr. Jayant Sinha was elaborating on earlier, what are the typologies of research ecosystem that needs to be built in the country to strengthen the work that is happening around just transition, not just in terms of planning, but also in terms of implementation? And then a remark from you in terms of also the role that you play as advisor to the India Just Transition Center. What role do you think the IJTC can play in bridging some of this research and knowledge gap? And also the fact that the kind of capacity building role that Mr. Kalyan was referring to, that they as at the district level would need to make sure some of these planning work can actually happen in terms of implementation. So Anshu, over to you for your remarks.
Thank you, Shirish, and I'll be very brief in the interest of time. Many congrats to CB and his entire team for this wonderful initiative. For me, it's an honor to be associated, and I thank you very much. Specific to what you mentioned, Shirish, the context of what we are working in is the fact that India's unique transition, unlike other countries where we talk about transition to a low carbon or net zero economy, we are starting from a very low base and then going to a zero at some point. So, starting from 3 billion tons to zero at some point in future. So whenever the peak happens, we'll be having a very low peak and then petering off. And then second unique aspect about India is the huge amount of informal sector, which CB's report has very nicely articulated. So those two, I think, make a very unique case for India. The fact that we are, if I can use the word, an experiment, which no other country has attempted, of going to zero or close to zero from a very low base of development, emissions, per capita, all indices. Now, given that the center which iForest has set up, I believe there are 3 unique sets of skills which they can bring to table to add to the discourse. Number one, the issues which have been raised by previous speakers from the government, outside government, from field, they require careful, independent examination. And it's great that an institution outside the government is examining these issues, which lends itself credibility and independence to the analysis. So independence of the studies, independence of the analysis is an absolutely important thing to aid the decision makers. Number two, the use of analytics and tools for research and analysis. And again, more often than not, the government agencies, even agencies like Niti Aayog, are often too much overwhelmed in their day-to-day work that they just don't have time to devote to this kind of stuff. And these kind of studies require sophisticated analytical tools. Some field studies like IJTC has done already. So those kind of skill sets for analyses. And third, drawing on global expertise and best practices. For example, CB mentioned about Germany, how root took 5 decades to transfer out of coal. How has Poland managed it? And how have other countries which depended heavily on coal have managed these? So drawing on those best practices and bringing to Indian context. So I think these are 3 core areas where IJTC can make a major difference and advise our policymakers, both at central level and at state levels. And with that, I'll hand back to you. I have a minute to spare. So back to you, Shirish.
Thank you so much, Anshu. And I completely agree. I think the India story of low peak and then still peaking and then reducing much faster. It's just that the communication around that needs to be more strengthened and made. And that's where the analytical work is needed. And I don't think at any level we do that quite well as of now. And I think that's something that we need to work. And thank you for outlining what IJTC could actually to focus on, and certainly agree on how we can draw on global practices. So one of the things that we are trying to do is to see if more of a South-South alliance can be put in place, because the kind of energy transition that may happen and will go in countries like South Africa or India or Indonesia is going to be much more different, but each can learn from the different experiences. Whereas what has been learned from Europe and UK's experience was also going to provide some information. And I think creating that infrastructure for cross-learning through a network of partners and organizations, where IJTC can be one of the key actors to do that. I will just take a couple of, well, I don't have a minute also to now do that, but just try and make an effort to summarize. I think we got some very clear points that we are looking at. One was around the communications around the calibration of the coal and the way it's likely to project in the Indian economy. I think that's going to be very important. The other thing was that how do we ensure that we want to minimize uncertainties and risks for communities who are extremely vulnerable? And this essentially looks at what this report talks about for those 60, at least those 60 districts to work with in the near term. And that's a point that Mr. Jairam Ramesh also made, that we need to have more clear near-term plans of action rather than looking at 20, 30-year scenarios. The point around need for a compensation and a consultative and transparent process of communication with communities, again, is going to be extremely issue. But overarching, I think the point that Mr. Jairam Ramesh made about the complexity, because this is a human issue. And I think that's something which should be at the center of the work that we look at. And so, internally within, as I was talking earlier about our social just transition strategy, which is just taking shape, we were looking at more ideas around role of jobs, role of equity and justice, and that's where some of these human issues aspects to come in. And of course, the third element of inclusion, which will also make a huge impact on the way we plan for it. So I would wrap up this. I want to thank all my panelists. Thank you so much. Sorry, my apologies to rush some of you for time. But I hand it back to the iForest team for any concluding remarks. I think there were a lot of questions that were coming in. I'm sure the team will be able to respond. But over to Chinmay or CB, to you for closing the session today. But I thank once again everyone.
Thank you, Shirish. And I also want to apologize. I think there are some excellent questions that have been asked by the participants, and we'll try and answer some of them. We will write to you. I will also, try just to announce that the book is already online. You can go to our website and have the book. Executive summary is downloadable. You can download it. You can read the book online, and it is available. I want to thank everyone. Jairam Ramesh ji, Jayant Sinha ji, Anshu, my dear friend. Nick is not here, but Nick Robbins, who is advisor to IJTC, Shirish, Mr. Kalyan, Suranjali. I'm really sorry. I think you all had a lot to contribute. Suranjali, Anshu, there should have been a lot more time for you to discuss. Shri Partha Bhattacharyaji's, your inputs are always excellent. And to all the participants and my team, I want to thank my team. I think they've done an excellent work. Shrishta, Chinmay, Dinah, Rahul, everyone. And thank you very much for coming for this event. We will be in touch. You will hear a lot from us.